What's up, everybody? Coach Mills here, coming at you with a brand new Overwatch video. And in this video, I'm going to be breaking down one of the most dominant heroes right now in the brand new, newly buffed McCree. And I'm going to give you targeted, actionable tips that you can start using in your game to dominate on this top tier hero. So let's break it all down. But before we do, the GameLeap website is your one-stop shop. If you want to climb to Grandmaster with ease, do yourself a favor, go check it out in the links down below for in-depth VOD reviews, advanced hero guides, and much more. But without further ado, let's jump into the video. Now, right off the bat, we're going to break down his abilities and give you targeted tips on how to improve and use them to the maximum effectiveness. Then we're going to give you some general tips to help you climb the ladder with this hero. Now, first off, we need to talk about his primary weapon, the Peacekeeper. Now, McCree is a single fire hit scan character that you'll be primarily incorporating flicking type motions with the occasional tracking as well. It's a combination weapon, but you're typically going to be doing flicking in fights because it's a tab-based weapon. That being said, one of the biggest problems that I see with a lot of McCree players is they're not consistently hitting their shots, and they're going far too fast, where they're flicking, and just whiffing shot after shot after shot, but they keep firing over and over again. This really comes down to a problem with your practicing, and I see too many McCrees like fight in the training bots where they're flicking all over the place, trying to kill the bots, but they're missing here, they're missing there. And the thing is, you should not be going fast until you are consistent. And this is one of the biggest problems with training. When you are trying to shoot the bots in practice, make sure that you're consistently hitting every single headshot before you start to ramp up. Consistency first and then speed. And a lot of players will try to ramp up that speed because they think speed, more DPS, more speed. But if you're practicing like that, you're actually going to be missing a lot of those shots in game as well. And it's more important to slow it down, get that consistency on point first before you ramp up that speed. Another thing is, generally, the Peacekeeper right-click is actually underused because a lot of people will, like, flame use, call it no skill. They say, oh, Mick right-click and things like that. But honestly, as far as damage per second, especially up against, like, big tanks and shields, the Peacekeeper right-click is extremely effective. Fighting a Rhine from closer range, or getting a guaranteed kill with a flash plus a right-click on something like a monkey that's not facing you that's hard to headshot. These sort of things are incredibly effective, and don't be afraid to use them at all. They're a very efficient part of your abilities that you should utilize. Now, move on to the next ability we got to talk about on McCree, and it's combat roll. Now, combat roll is going to move 7.2 meters, which is going to be important later on. I'm going to touch back on that. But the big thing that you need to ask yourself when using the combat roll is the dichotomy between an increase in DPS versus a safer positioning. You see, McCree is very positioning based, which I'm going to talk about later, but combat roll is one of his few ways to adjust his positioning. If a monkey dives you and you don't have your combat roll, getting away is going to be incredibly difficult, but if you do, getting away to heal is going to be very easy. But the combat roll can be used aggressively as well for an increase in DPS. Identifying when you need to increase that DPS more quickly, add that roll in, get that reload, keep firing, and you can get value off of that versus saving it for a situation where you're getting dove by a tracer, by a monkey, something like that, and you need that mobility aspect of it. This is the big choices that you have to make, and I see far too often where McCrees will just waste their roll and then they need it later on, but they don't have it to get out of a sticky situation. So typically err on the side of caution, especially when you're up against an enemy team composition that has more divers, things like we talked about with that tracer, those Genjis, those monkeys. If they don't have these type of characters, you could of course just use it to increase your DPS more and use it more liberally. However, if they do, you need to be a little bit more conservative typically so that you have a means to actually get to safety if you do get dove. Now, moving on to the next ability we got to talk about is the Flashbang that actually does 25 damage. It goes a total of 7 meters with a 3-meter radius. Now, that means combined with your combat roll, you can actually cross 17.2 meters of distance if an enemy is away from you and you roll into them, hit them with that, of course, Flashbang at max range. That is actually a really far distance, and in a true 1v1, if an enemy is not careful of that, you can close that distance so fast in a essentially one-tap tons and tons of squishies in the game. So that's just something to keep in mind, and generally practicing the maximum distance you can either throw a flashbang after you roll, and just measuring that and practicing that is something that you can do a whole bunch of times in like a practice range and really get a feel for your distance and range, because you want complete control and you always want to know in your mind when an enemy is stepping in the danger zone of barely being connected, and you never want to throw your flashbang out and just barely miss an enemy, because in a lot of matchups that just means you're gonna die. Now move on to the last ability that we got to cover about McCree, and it's his Deadeye. And typically when you want a Deadeye, if you're doing it like out in the open, you typically want to be strafing. You strafe in one direction and then change it up and start strafing in the other direction. This is generally just to miss things like a Hanzo arrow or like a sleep dart. Different sorts of projectiles will be harder to hit when a McCree is strafing and then suddenly changes directions. Now that being said, there are better ways to get guaranteed value with Deadeye than just randomly popping it. Using it behind shields, especially as the enemy is pushing on to contest a point, that can be absolutely so overpowered. If you're like behind a Ryan shield or even something like a DM, using Deadeye can get you a lot of easy value, because some people will peek out in order to shut you down, but if you get protected, they'll just die and they'll be a free kill for you. Now typically being greedy often with no setup is gonna get you killed the higher in rank you go. Maybe when you're in the lower ranks you can get away with it, you can pop high noon behind enemy lines and get like 6 people, but as people's awareness get better as you climb the ranks and their mechanical skill get better, you're gonna get headshotted, slept, hooked, shut down over and over again if you're doing this and getting too greedy without setup, even if you're doing it completely by surprise. This is an important thing to keep in mind, and it's no perfect formula. It's more of a balance that's constantly changing, so definitely adopt it. If you ever use a Deadeye and it gets shut down, instantly remember that mistake and try to adjust your playstyle with the Deadeye for future use. Now moving on to the actionable tips that we got for you on McCree. First off, we got to talk about one of the most important things, and it's his health buff, and what does that mean for the hero in general. Now the extra survivability is actually more important than you realize. First off, a McCree can survive at max HP from a headshot from a damage boosted Ashe, which means you can actually challenge her a little bit more, assuming that you have your roll and that you can easily get behind natural cover. But keep in mind, if you do get headshotted, she's gonna quickly follow that up with a dynamite if she hasn't used it, so definitely err on the side of caution a little bit there. But a quick double headshot from you onto her can also win that matchup, so it's actually kind of a lot closer than it seems if she's in that medium range. Now on top of that, there's some matchups across the board that you're favored in more generally. Matchups like against Tracer, Genji, and specifically Doomfist. These matchups are matchups that you're just gonna have an easier time, but of course you're gonna still need to be able to consistently hit your shots, and putting pressure on something like a Tracer is really the only way to force out her abilities aggressively and set up those perfect scenarios where you can either hit her with a flashbang or just get a headshot and just shut her down. Now remember, I've always suggested this, but I still do. The best way to get better at 1v1s, which is going to be really important while playing McCree because you're going to be the threat that everyone goes after. You need to be playing Triad Free-For-All consistently. Just fill yourself up with these matchups over and over and over again. Get them like crazy. Go up against hundreds of Tracers, hundreds of Genjis, and just practice the matchup over and over and over again. That's the only way to get better at it. That's the only way to start reading these characters. And if you just go up against them over and over, you're going to have the heads up against someone who has only played the matchup a couple of times in ranked, and winning these matchups could be the difference, because remember, they're either going to be going after your supports that you're protecting, or they're going to be going after you, so definitely keep that in mind. Now move on to the next big tip that we got for you on McCree, and it's about one of the most important things, and it's positioning on McCree, because remember, McCree has some of the lowest mobility in the entire game, which means he is vulnerable when he's isolated from natural cover. Always being within a roll's distance away from natural cover is absolutely one of the most important things that you could be doing on McCree, because you got to think about it. If you are outside out in the open, right, and an enemy attacks you, if you roll in or behind natural cover, all of a sudden you have protection and you have an area that you know you're not going to take fire from. That means if enemies want to come and chase you, you have a greater success rate with not only just being safe in general, but connecting with your matchup turning flashbang. Very, very important to say the least. On top of that, there's going to be certain scenarios where you're up against some some dive type compositions or up against a Doomfist or a Genji or things like that where you should literally be conjoined at the hip with your healer. Very, very close to them. You have an Ana, you have a Zen. You are playing very close to them, and if anything dives you together with your CC, their healing and focus fire, you're going to be able to take on any single or maybe even duo diver that is really coming to harass you or get a numbers advantage. Now, the third big actionable tip that you need to understand about McCree is while he's a very good character to climb the lower ranks with, in some compositions, he is typically not the best. If you're playing a composition that has no shield, a dive-based composition, and you're on a map that is extremely wide open, that means you have no natural cover and you're going to have no artificial cover in something like a shield, and it's going to be really, really difficult for you to navigate in that landscape. Up against characters like Hanzo and Widow, it's going to be hard for you to outrange these characters and challenge them, and they can typically win the matchup just with a single headshot, which they can spam unadulterated. Now, that being said, however, there's still a way to get value on McCree and just get value on McCree in general, and this is the last big actionable tip that we got for you, and it's when to flank on McCree. Now, a very important thing that you need to think about on McCree is timing, and I see that a lot of McCrees get this absolutely wrong. They take too long on a flank and they get no value. They flank when the enemy is regrouping and they get caught out, or the enemy team is going to dive onto their team and they start that flank not there to peel. You got to think about who you're leaving behind and how safe they are. If they don't have any form of security besides you, and you know that the enemy Doomfist has been out to get them the entire game, perhaps flanking at that exact moment is not correct. However, if you know that there's some time between the enemy actually engaging your team and you actually executing your flank, if you can execute your flank at the same time or right before an enemy Doomfist sets up to make a play, you can get a lot of value on it and mess up the engagement by the enemy. Now, on top of that, the same rules before up positioning still apply because you still want to have a way to get out if your flank goes wrong. I'm not saying flank all the way behind the enemy and just be standing in the open trying to fight them. That is the way to just get shut down and killed. However, taking an off angle and flanking from like an open doorway or a form of natural cover, or if you don't connect with those first couple of shots that tell you, hey, this flank could turn into some kills, and instead you whiff, you give away your position, and you lose that element of surprise, you can just roll back away to natural cover and regroup with your team, and if enemies want to go pursue you, they have the risk of getting killed or potentially the tables turned on them with your flashbang. Being able to abuse the fact that McCree is one of the hardest characters in the entire game to chase is something that you absolutely should, and don't just let yourself get killed because you're standing in the middle of nowhere, you miss a couple of shots and the entire enemy jumps you because you have no way out. Now, the last thing that you need to think about when you're flanking is you can absolutely never give away your information pre-flank. If you start a flank and even a single character on the enemy team gets a whiff or a tiny glance of you making that flank, you're gonna get cut off, killed. Unpredictability is the most important thing that I talked about before, and if you ever get spotted, it's time to mission abort, go back to your team, play it safe, or there's gonna be a waiting Roadhog, a waiting Genji, a waiting Hanzo around the corner, just ready to kill you for free. But if you want to see in-depth advanced VOD reviews of McCree in action, definitely go check out the GameLeap website where we have in-depth Grandmaster VODs showing you step-by-step exactly what you should be doing on McCree in the links down below. But thank you so much for coming by. I hope you learned something. That's all we got for you today. I'm Coach Mills, and of course, until next time,